The Federal Reserve and all central banks are trapped at this point. Eventually, what our computer shows is after about 2032, China will emerge as the financial capital of the world. So what are you hearing? You're hearing Ursula talking about taking money from private accounts that's unused to fund their war. It's the same shit all over again. I have been talking to some people in Congress, and they seem to actually be agreeing with me now. I said, we got to get out of NATO. NATO's just a retirement home for neocons. As I said, war brings default in debt. So this is what gold is reflecting. We don't get off our couch and stop watching TV until it affects us.
Hello everybody, my name is Paul Buitink and welcome back to Reinvent Money, a podcast about money and power aimed at helping investors understand the bigger picture and making the right decisions. Today, for the first time on the show, well-known American forecaster Martin Armstrong, who developed the economic confidence model. Go to armstrongeconomics.com to find more information about him. Hi Martin, welcome. Great to have you on.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
So Moody's was the last of the three big rating agencies to remove the US of its AAA status last week. How big of a deal is this?
I don't know why you would call any government debt AAA anyhow, but historically, governments never pay, they default. So I don't know. I think it's just, these ratings tend to be more smoke and mirrors. That the theory is that, well, government can always print their way out of a debt, but it's interesting, but honestly, there is no government that is AAA. You just saw Japan rates hit record highs. I mean, they're all in trouble.
Yeah.
I mean, this is why Europe wants war, because they know either they create a war or they default, and you're going to have everybody with pitchforks storming the parliaments,
Yeah, and the U.S. Treasury is, of course, an important foundation of the modern financial world. But I think with the status they have right now, it's still a high liquid asset according to Basel regulation, right? So if they would drop a few ratings more, then possibly that could have ramification for collateral reasons, or
they probably wouldn't do that. The dollar is being the reserve currency. It's really based on the fact that the U.S. has the largest consumer-based economy in the world. So Japan has to sell their Toyotas to Americans. Germany has to sell their BMWs. And when you do that, you still have to price in dollars. And I know people were saying, it's the dollar's backed by oil. Not really. I mean, if you look at the percentage of oil of world trade, it's less than 10%. So it's all really the consumer goods side. And, the other factor is that the world financial system is that these central banks use the currencies as their reserves. In the U.S., domestic banks must keep their reserves in U.S. Treasuries. In Europe, they must keep them in European debt. These regulations are deeply intertwined with the whole banking system. So it's not so easy to unravel it.
Yeah, so I guess also the rating agencies are probably not even allowed to downgrade the debt that much, because otherwise they would basically jeopardize the financial system, and they are of course also all related, the same people at the same places. So I guess they wouldn't even go that far.
No, I don't think they would. if they did, you would really cause a major crisis. But and they probably would be, they'd send the ninjas in and start storming their offices. But
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
we just have to really look at the system that has developed.
Yeah, and more important than the rating agencies, of course, is the bond market, and we see 30 years Treasuries now with rates above 5%. Is that something that worries you, or how far do you think this can go before it starts breaking things?
Oh, quite a ways, but when you have Europe beating the war drums, interest rates rise with war. Simple as that. And most people don't realize, but when the Federal Reserve was actually created, it was done brilliantly to stimulate the economy. That's where the term lender of last resort came from. When banks were tight and wouldn't lend, they would buy corporate paper, not government. So therefore, a company didn't have to lay off its workforce, who could issue 90-day paper. Then what happened was World War I came, and Congress instructed the Fed, no, stop buying corporate, buy ours. And then they never put it back. Then, excuse me, then you had FDR come in 1935, and he usurped the entire Federal Reserve System to get his socialistic agenda in. I mean, you can go on like newspaper.com and look at the old newspapers from the 1920s. The reason we had 13 branches is that each branch was independent. It was to balance the capital flows within the country. For example, in 1906, you had the San Francisco earthquake, and the insurance companies were on the East Coast. So the money went from the East to the West. That caused shortages in the East, and that resulted in the panic of 1907. And that's when J.P. Morgan got all the bankers together and said, if we don't bail out the banks are in trouble, they're going to come after us. So that worked, and that was the model for the Federal Reserve. All right, but what FDR did, he usurped the Federal Reserve so he could get his socialistic agenda through. He moved it to Washington, D.C., and made one interest rate fits all. So why we still have 13 branches? I mean, I don't really know. They're not independent anymore. So they changed the entire system. Then you can look at when World War II came. Congress basically directed in the White House, and the Treasury directed the Federal Reserve to buy Treasury debt if it exceeded a certain level of interest rate. So they put a cap on it, kind of like QE, but the other way around. And then in 1951, most people don't realize, but they tried it again for the Korean War. And the Federal Reserve said, enough is enough. That's it. And there was actually a coup, and the Federal Reserve refused to follow the White House or the Treasury. So, I mean, these things have been, going on for a long time. And the central banks are actually in trouble in the sense that, all they have is Keynesian economics. And when Keynes came up with his theory in the 30s, it at least made logical sense. U.S. had a balanced budget. So if you raised interest rates or lowered interest rates, it really affected us directly. But after that, government, unfortunately, he also advocated running a deficit, but not perpetually. He said during a recession, you could run a deficit to stimulate demand. And once he did that, they go, oh, that's a great idea. And they just have run deficits ever since, in good times, bad times, whatever. So the Federal Reserve and all central banks are trapped at this point. If they raise interest rates to try and stop inflation, they create more because the government is the biggest borrower in the room. So the whole system is really whacked out. People don't realize. You hear a lot of people, oh, they'll shut down the Fed. Really, you don't understand. That's like blaming the gun for killing somebody, not the person that pulled the trigger. The bulk of the money is the debt,
right?
Because what's happened, at least under Bretton Woods before 71, if you had an e-bond and you went to the bank and you said, all right, I got $100 e-bond, would you lend me 50 on it? The answer was no. You could not borrow against government debt. So that's where the theory was it's less inflationary to borrow than to print. But then after 71, that all disappeared. It would be less inflationary to print than to borrow at this stage. Because we're paying $1 trillion in interest to keep rolling the debt. You should have just printed the damn money and get it over with. And because this is just going to multiply, into the trillions by the time you end up, at the end of the decade.
Right.
So that's what's all coming to a bust.
Yeah. So Powell is not able to do anything about it. Of course, he can keep the interest rate at the same level, or maybe even increase them, but he cannot stop this mathematical process of ever increasing that, and in the end, a breaking point.
Yeah, the Federal Reserve is not the problem.
No,
it's this Congress and what they spend. Because if you want to trade gold futures, you can post T-bills. So that's now money that just pays interest. That's all.
And do you think the Fed then ultimately will step in and start printing again? Because there's basically no other exit for them, right? They need to accommodate.
I think it's all coming to a head. They're also, you have all the other central banks knowing that they're in trouble. And that's what this whole CBDC stuff is about. It's total control. Mm-hmm. In the United States, however, the Fed has come out and said, no, we can't, we're not doing that. And Trump has come out and said, no. Why? Because it would be unconstitutional. If the Fed had a CBDC, they would need a search warrant to look at your account under the Fourth Amendment. So we're a little bit different. They don't need that, in Europe or Canada. They just do whatever they want to do. So that's why the Fed has said no, they're not going to do a CBDC. It's not being magnanimous. It's just being constitutional that you'd have to change it. And that's why you have the individual banks trying to create their coins. And then the Fed can regulate them. It's kind of like COVID. All right, the government can't restrict your freedom of speech. So they pick up the phone and they tell YouTube to do it. You have no right to free speech, anywhere other than the government. That's it. If you read the First Amendment, government shall not. It doesn't say YouTube or Facebook or anybody else, So that model is what they're using. So a private bank can issue a CBDC in a way that's just private. And there are already regulations in place that if I sent you 100,000, they would say, gee, that's strange. And they're supposed to report that activity to the Treasury. So they don't need a search warrant. These are little intricacies behind the scenes.
Yeah. And then if we look at how things can develop, like we already have seen over time that the foreign holders of US debt, that percentage is declining, and more domestic holders of US debt we see. Are we going to see some sort of a Japan scenario where most of the debt at some point is held by American actors? And is that a problem? Because Japan also survives with debt to GDP ratios much higher than the US.
Yeah, no, it's not necessarily a problem. But what set that in motion was that the Biden administration was really run by the neocons. And you have Blinken, remove Russia from the SWIFT system. I should point out that in 2014, Obama went to SWIFT and wanted them to remove Russia, and they refused. They said, you're not going to turn this into a weapon. So they replaced the head of SWIFT in 2019. And this guy just, okay, whatever you want, And so once they removed Russia from the SWIFT system, Blinken was a complete nut job, really. All he looks at is his neocon agenda. And he threatened China, if you help Russia, we'll do the same to you. Really? So China goes, okay, fine, no problem. And that creates BRICS. All right. Setting up an alternative system since they turned SWIFT into a weapon. So you've had people misinterpret this, what they're saying, the de-dollarization. It's got nothing to do with gold or the debt level or anything else. It has to do with power. If we went to war with China and China held 10%, do you really think we would pay it? You default on it. You can go on eBay and buy all the bonds that were defaulted on by all of Europe. Britain went into a moratorium. They eventually came back. But, like France is in its fifth republic, and each new republic never pays the debt of the last one, they were bad guys. We'll be different, and Spain became a serial defaulter 7 times. Why people even lend money to governments is amazing. But
only Liechtenstein or something is one of the few countries that ever paid back its full debt, I think. But apart from that, there are not many examples of that in history.
No, Andrew Jackson did that in the 1820s because he wanted to shut down the central bank. Romania did, but even Canada defaulted in 1931. So, that's what created the Great Depression. It wasn't tariffs. It was 9,000 banks failed because all these bonds defaulted. And they used to be listed on the New York Stock Exchange. And you just, they all went to zero.
Yeah, I totally agree with you that it was foolish of the West to weaponize the dollar and the euro, of course, because Europe also confiscated Russian assets in February of 22. But it would also go hand in hand then with the US owning more and more of its own debt. So perhaps we'll see sort of a Western currency bloc where the dollar is still dominant, and then we have a BRICS currency bloc where the yuan or whatever is dominant. And then is that a scenario we could look forward to?
Yes. Look, we do have offices in China, and I'm very familiar with all the, we have offices basically everywhere from Dubai on. So I've had to deal with a lot of these governments. I was even called in by China in 1997 with the Asian currency crisis to help them then. China has looked at the economic models. For example, Europe is more of a 18th century mercantile model that we make stuff, we sell it to everybody else. But if you look at the net worth of a German citizen, all right, strongest economy, yes. The net worth of an individual is below that of Italy. Why? Because they keep their taxes so high, restrictions. They're afraid of hyperinflation because of the 20s. So the United States is the biggest economy because it's a consumer-based economy. To give you an example, if you look at all the total consumer spending in the world, US is 25%. Russia is $1.29 out of 10. Europe is $1.29 out of 10. So China is mimicking the United States. It's trying to build its consumer-based economy, so, Silk Road, etc. It has looked at Europe and has looked at the United States. So eventually, what our computer shows is after about 2032, China will emerge as the financial capital of the world.
Right.
Probably, Europe thinks it can, conquer Russia. I guess the third time would be a charm or something. I don't know. Our financial system of this debt. People, think, gee, you just go to a gold standard or something like that. You have to change the political system. Because what it's all about is vote for me and I'll give you a free car and a lollipop. That's got to stop. It's vote for me because I'll manage the economy better than he will. Once we enter into the socialistic agenda from FDR on, it's all about bribing people to vote. So you can't do that with a gold standard or, Bitcoin standard or anything like that. You have to have something that's going to expand when you're promising all kinds of stuff. So you have to change the political agenda first, I think, before you could ever change the monetary system.
And how are we going to do that then? That's because it seems impossible to me almost, because it looks like every country is falling into the same trap. Every time we try again, and then, so how are we going to establish a new political mindset then, that we should stop bribing politicians and go to a more conservative and more restrained government and more freedom for citizens?
If you look at history, this has happened many times. How does it happen? It basically is when you're in these Ponzi schemes is selling debt perpetually. And what they're doing, they sell the new debt to pay off the old. Because they never pay anything off. That can keep going, provided somebody's still in line to buy it. When the buying stops, that's when the default comes. If you look at the city of Mainz, I think that's where the Gutenberg press was. So it was kind of like a dot-com bubble for there. And they were borrowing and borrowing and borrowing. And when it stopped, they defaulted. They couldn't sell new debt to pay off the old. Even Gutenberg left the city. The taxes got outrageous. The creditors eventually invaded and sacked the city, and that was it. So it's when you can't sell the new debt. And that's the problem. So yes, Japan can keep buying it, but at some point, the system just breaks.
Yeah, we see the yields in Japan also going up a lot lately.
Yes, they're now at record highs again, and we'll keep going. Japan is probably it's a coin toss as to who's going to go default first. Is it Japan or Europe?
Yeah. So before the US defaults, we will either have Japan or Europe defaulting. So what does your system say about the European Union? How much runway do they still have? Because things seem to be disintegrating in front of our eyes.
Yeah, no, it's look, when were creating the euro, they called me in. I met with them in '98. Laid it out. Here's how we create a currency. All the promises, oh, we'll all pay the same interest rates. This will defeat the dollar, blah, blah, blah. All right. All just propaganda. What happened was Helmut Kohl was the Chancellor of Germany at the time. And you can look it up. Before he died, he said he acted like a dictator and he didn't allow the German people to vote to join the euro. He said he would have lost 7-3. So he took Germany into the euro and basically unilaterally, really. And his requirement was no consolidation of the debt. Because he figured that, it would be perceived that they're bailing out Greece and Italy, etc. So he knew the German people were against that sort of thing. So I warned them. I said, if you don't consolidate the debt, you'll never compete with the dollar. Because as a fund manager, I can pick up the phone and say, buy me $10 billion worth of US Treasuries. I can't do that with Europe. With Europe, I still have to make the same decision. Gee, do I want Germany? Do I want France? Do I want Italy? So all they did was move the volatility from the currency markets to the bond markets. So you got all the spreads between, the bonds, etc. So they never created the euro correctly. Now, the problem here is I warned them that, the one interest rate for, not going to work. U.S. has a single currency, but 50 states, they pay different interest rates based upon their credit rating. So this is what's going to happen in Europe. I mean, it's not being brilliant. It's just common sense. And they told me in '98, we just have to get the euro in to create the infrastructure in the central government. We'll worry about the debt later. Here we are, 2025. They still haven't addressed it. All right. And probably the people I spoke to are probably no longer there anyhow. But the problem, you can see what happened in 2010 when Greece got into trouble. As soon as that happened, the traders in these dealing rooms, you make a lot of money shorting it, okay? And then they go, who's next? Oh, Spain, That's what will happen. One EU nation can't pay, gets in trouble, and it will turn into a contagion that spreads through all of the EU. You can read, I suggest, Herbert Hoover's memoirs, and they're free online. Read 1931, when all the defaults happened. And this is exactly what happened then as well. And he said the capital acted like a loose cannon on the deck of a ship in the middle of a tempest, shooting off in every which direction so fast they couldn't figure out where it was going next. And that's what pushed the dollar up so high. As all these countries are defaulting, the dollar went up so high. That's what, inspired Smoot-Hawley with tariffs, because everybody's, currencies was declining so they could sell agriculture cheaper than Americans, so that's where the tariffs came in. But like I said, the tariffs only came in June 1930, and had nothing to do with creating the Great Depression or anything else. That was just another Democratic propaganda during the 1932 election, because the two guys that proposed it for agriculture were Republicans. That's all.
So the tariffs are more of an effect instead of a cause.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
But
then going back to Europe, you see this on one hand, you see a lot of populist parties gaining ground. So there you see sort of disintegration effect. At the same time, you see countries also being more aligned, at least on the leadership level, where especially towards Russia or the US, you see the Europeans, quite a few Europeans, especially elitists, see this as an opportunity to forge an even stronger Europe. Even UK is sort of approaching Brussels again to work more closely together. So how do you see these two forces? And if we're going into some sort of sovereign debt crisis again, what would be the trigger?
If you really look at the German hyperinflation, most of the interpretations are wrong there too. It wasn't the printing of the money that caused it. If you look closely, in December 1922, Germany couldn't make its reparation payments. So what did it do? It confiscated 10% of everybody's accounts and issued bonds. The hyperinflation then starts in 23. Okay. And so what are you hearing? You're hearing Ursula talking about taking money from private accounts that's unused to fund their war. It's the same shit all over again. Now, when Hitler came to power in 33, he passed a law that it was illegal to have an account outside of Germany because he was trying to bring the money back. The way to once they confiscated 10% in December 22, the smart people moved their accounts outside of Germany. So everybody had all these offshore accounts.
Yeah, and they, of course, have inside knowledge, right? They know in advance that it's going to happen. So.
Even the ones that didn't, afterwards, whatever they had left, at 90%, it left. And then Switzerland started its numbered accounts in 1934 because of this.
All right.
All right. So, you have Ursula saying, oh, there's unused money and we can use that to fund the war, against Russia. And I have very good contacts, in a lot of these different governments. And I can tell you that the real instigator seems to be Macron out of France. He's telling them they don't need the United States because France's nukes are outside of NATO. We can provide the umbrella to protect Europe, not the United States. Forget them. And Ukraine has been basically just the vanguard. They don't give two shits about if any Ukrainian is still standing. And this is why Romania is, they're trying to do the same thing in Romania. And they really think that Ukraine has seriously weakened Germany. Weakened Russia. And even Germany is talking about sending in troops, etc. And they think that they can actually take Russia. And I've spoken to some. I said, you don't think he's going to push the button? And they said, no, because it would blow back on Russia.
Which button you mean?
The
nuclear.
Nuke.
Or,
okay.
You think Russia would do that? Because indeed it would set off a chain of events that would also obliterate Russia. So why would they?
Basically I would. You have Kalis, who's, the former PM of Estonia, openly saying Russia's too big and needs to be broken up. If you have a gun, somebody's breaking into your house, are you going to use it or not? I'm also worried about that because I talked to Jeffrey Sachs about it too, and I read Annie Jacobson's book about a nuclear scenarios, and it's awful. So I think we should do everything we can in our power as mankind to avoid that scenario from happening. I agree. This is I have been talking to some people in Congress, and they seem to actually be agreeing with me now. I said, we got to get out of NATO because they're going to try and create some sort of a false flag and drag the United States into it. And, you have basically Trump removing, troops from Europe. It's honestly, if I am Putin, I wouldn't agree to a peace deal. I mean, when you have Europe arming to the teeth, you just have Poland and order um, all males that for military training. They're drafting people. We had staff in Germany who said that even people up to 60 years old have been told to report. It doesn't look like they are interested in peace themselves.
Yeah, and today Putin, because today's Monday, the 19th of May, Putin and Trump are supposed to have a call, I believe. Do you expect anything from that?
I don't see how. I don't know. I mean, like I said, if I was Putin, I wouldn't agree. Look, they had the Minsk agreement, and that was a peace agreement. The Donbass was supposed to be able to vote like Yugoslavia, breaking up according to ethnic lines. And Merkel, actually publicly said, well, when they asked, why didn't you enforce it? She's, well, we never intended to honor it.
Yeah, but Russia also wasn't honoring the agreements either, right? So it's
why would you then sit? That's why Trump said, no, they don't have a right to sit at the table.
Yeah.
Why would somebody believe them when, I mean, what you do confidentially is one thing, but what you do actually publicly is like a slap in the face to everybody else.
Yeah, but Trump needs to show something, right? Because it's he first promised 1 day, then 100 days. If he doesn't, maybe Putin can say yes to it in order to help out Trump a bit. Because if Trump doesn't achieve any result, he will probably go back to either supplying arms or maybe adopting more sanctions. Or what's Trump's plan B?
He probably will do the sanctions. There's not much really left of Ukraine, despite all the propaganda. Ukrainian sources tell me that they have lost over 1 million. And I speak to some of the military. Even when on the Kursk thing, they thought they were just going to defend the border. At the last minute, they were told to invade. Zelensky fired his basic chief of staff because he disagreed with him. This guy's taking orders from NATO in London and Paris. Doesn't give a second thought to the Ukrainian people.
Well, we could also argue that he had the guts to stay in Kiev, and he tries whatever he can to protect his country.
Whether he's protecting it or not, or just you got 8 million that have fled. We had employees in Kiev and in Donetsk. They're in Berlin right now. And they have no intention of going back either.
Yeah. So you're not expecting a solution there anytime soon then?
Look, it's like Yugoslavia. All right. Even Czechoslovakia, it's split ethnic lines. Czechs versus Slovakia. The Donbass they're all Russians. Crimea, if you've ever been there, maybe about 15% of the population are Tatars from the old Mongol invasion in the 1240s. They're not Ukrainian. They speak Russian.
Yeah, but if you speak Russian, you're not a Russian. Like if I talk to someone in Belgium, in Flanders, they speak Dutch, but they're not Dutch. I mean, it's a huge difference between speaking a language and identifying as another nationality. I mean, it's
what I mean is that ethnically they've been there for hundreds of years. It's like Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia ended up splitting according to the ethnic lines. And most of the complaints of Syria, though the Albanians, that's what all the war of Kosovo was all about. Is ethnic basic fighting.
So that would be the solution in your view if we, in the end, Ukraine would be divided amongst ethnic lines.
the same as Yugoslavia. I think it's, until you did that, there was the Kosovo War, bombings and everything else. And that's the only solution. You look at even Greece, they were given, a handful of jets, and what did they publicly say? Oh, now we can stage a sneak attack on Turkey.
Two NATO states.
I know, exactly. The ethnic diversity in that area has been around for a long time. Otto Bismarck, the former chairman of Germany in 1888 said Europe is going to go into a major war and it's going to come from the Balkans. So, you have to understand that area was also at one time part of the Ottoman Empire. So then you had colonization from Islam into that area. So you have three different religions. You have Islam, you have Orthodox Christianity, and then you have, Catholicism on top of everything else. It's kind of like the Middle East. You had differences between the Sunnis and Shiites. Look, you even had, look at Ireland, it's separated between, Catholics and Protestants. I've been to Bavaria, and they still have a holiday they celebrate. So what's the holiday? Winning the war. So which war is this? Oh, we defeated the Protestants in Prussia. These things go on for hundreds of years. They just remember that. I've been in Athens when Merkel was against bailing out Greek banks, and they were protesting, walking down the streets in Nazi uniforms.
Yeah, it's these some of these feuds they stay alive for many hundred years. And what do you make then of because the Middle East we haven't discussed in detail yet, but what do you make of Trump shaking hands and becoming friends with al-Shara, a former wanted terrorist? Is Trump basically applying the same neocon tricks as his predecessors?
No, I'll say this. I've met many heads of state, but actually Trump was the only one that really impressed me.
Oh, nice. Yeah,
I went to dinner at Mar-a-Lago back in March of 2020 when he was president the first time. And that's when he said he wanted to pull the troops out of Afghanistan, but it was the reason. He said he was sick and tired of writing letters to their parents that your son died for God and country. And to quote him, he said, "What are we doing there? They've been fighting over borders for 1,000 years. What difference are we going to make?" And I've spoken to RFK, and he would too. He even asked me, "How would you stop the war?" He was anti-war. So that attitude is, I know, legitimate there. I even told RFK, "You should join Trump because at least the two of you are anti-war." Trump is, I would suspect, like on Russia, maybe sanctions because he is anti-war. Yeah. He's trying to stop all this stuff.
And he's been consistent for decades about that, right? So it's not like...
it's... and he's pulling the troops out of Europe. I don't think he wants to send American troops into battle. And this is why the neocons were so against Trump. You even had Dick Cheney endorsing Camilla. And I can tell you they're there in Paris and London now. And NATO's just a retirement home for neocons, really. I've seen the internal memos. When all the money was going to climate change, they were upset and they were asking, how do we remain relevant? And they only remain relevant by saying, oh, Russia's going to take all of Europe.
Yeah, and then what is the trigger then for, because we just discussed earlier the fate of the European Union or Euro, and then we discussed the war in Ukraine, but how does the war in Ukraine in the end, for example, lead to another sovereign debt crisis in Europe?
I think, if she pulls a stunt of confiscating private assets to pay for the war, you're going to see a similar reaction to what happened in Germany in 1922.
Capital flight.
Yeah. That's why they're pushing for the CBDCs and to cancel the currency. Spain just put it in, I think it was 3,000 euros. You can't withdraw from your account without government permission. Australia is doing the same thing now. So they know they have trouble coming. And look, I mean, the only country I would say that actually has done something I've said was China. Most of the rest of them I talk to, but I think it's just largely to say, gee, have you changed your mind yet? It's not that they actually do something.
What did China do, and what kind of advice did you give China?
I told them, I said, if I were you, I wouldn't buy debt from the New York bankers. I would tell the Treasury, you want to buy direct or forget it. They did it in a week.
And when was that?
A few years ago. I mean, I was like, what? Oh my God. So I have to be careful what I do say.
Right. Yeah.
They tend to
listen sometimes.
It's also when I was called in back in 97 and met with the central bank, I was surprised why they called me and not some academic. And when I got there, I saw why. They had sent people out who worked on the various trading desks in New York, London, and Tokyo, learned how the markets functioned, and then went back to run the bank. So when I came back, guys from the Treasury and the Fed called me, gee, what was it like? You're the first guy to go over there. And I just took the knife, stuck it in their back, and I turned it. I said, very interesting. They only hire people with experience.
Yeah, interesting story.
But they admitted they were different than China. I was also taken to a room where in this facility that was surrounded by tanks back then and had huge satellites on the roof, and they were downloading everything from the internet. And what I was impressed with was that they were monitoring absolutely everything in the country, but they were not interfering. And I was shown they had 249 different teas. You've always heard all the tea in China, but I was really shocked. And I had to answer questions that were very interesting. They were wondering why this tea that would sell for, let's say, $1 here was selling for $5 over there. I said, where does it come from? Oh, here. I said, first you have transportation costs. They go, oh, yeah, okay. I said, then somebody will pay more for this tea than another if they like it more. Oh, okay. Under communism, if it was $1 here, it had to be $1 over there, even if it cost you $10 to get it there. All right.
That's how you get shortages.
Exactly. And communism basically looked at everybody as a drone. They eliminated human nature. And why would somebody pay more for this tea than that? Oh, that's strange to them. We're all the same. Equality and stuff. So it was interesting to have a front row seat to see why communism was actually failing.
Can imagine.
So it was very enlightening. I'm glad I went there. I even got to see the Great Wall.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, so maybe some time left for a few questions from viewers.
Sure.
So first of all, what do you think of the great taking? I talked to David a bunch of times on my channel. I think it's sort of in line with what you just said, right? If push comes to shove, if things get really tight for governments, they may want to confiscate assets. Is that correct?
Europe can do it. I don't think the U.S. can. It's again, they can't even do the CBDCs. It's completely different. The only thing they can confiscate would be under civil asset forfeiture, and they'd have to tie it to some sort of criminal activity. Um, um, but I think that is more in line with Europe, and even Ursula's even come out and said that.
Yeah. So what do you advise a young European? Stick around and try to change the political system, or leave Europe? But the other day I talked to 2,000 entrepreneurs on stage who were all thinking of leaving Holland because of high taxes, increasing red tape. What would you advise be to any young European at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, look, probably to move, mainly because of not just the economic side, but you're also looking at the prospect of being drafted. You're seeing. I had a client who went to the so-called peace conference in Vienna a couple months ago, and he said, "This is not a peace conference; it's a war conference. Everybody's talking about drafting, this, that." And he says, "Nobody's talking about peace.
War is peace, right?"
Yeah, it's they see that as the solution rather than reforming. I mean, I know, Klaus Schwab, his "you'll own nothing and be happy" was basically, it was more than communism. It was like, we're going to default, but we're doing it for you. We're going to relieve you of your debts and your burdens. At the same time, it's them, right? I mean, if they default on your debt, there goes your pension funds, etc., right? Where I was basically on the opposite side of the table saying, look, we can get out of this if you reform. I did a video, it's on YouTube, called The Solution. You can go into that. Basically, how would I deal with it? I would do the same thing that I would do with, in bailing out a company, a debt to equity swap. I would swap the debt for coupons. You then take the coupon to your local broker, Merrill Lynch or whatever, and then you can only buy corporate bonds or corporate shares domestically in your own country. And then they would then take that and redeem it. And then, yes, you're monetizing, but you're getting it done with rather than a complete default.
Interesting.
And back in the 90s, I was called in by Congress to transform Social Security into a wealth fund. I laid it all out. This is how we do it. And the Democrats wouldn't vote for it because they said when they got in, they wanted to be able to change the fund managers. I said, I don't care who the guy voted for. That's not the issue. It's what his track record is, but could never get it through because it's all, what do I get out of it? That's Washington.
Yeah, that's deeply broken then. Final question. What is your analysis? What do your models say about gold and its price for the remainder of the year?
Look, eventually, gold does not go up with inflation. It peaked in 1980 at 875 and went down for 19 years. The national debt went up, inflation went up, etc. Gold rises with geopolitical concerns. If you look at, it went from $100 to $400 between 76 and December 79. Went from 400 to 875 in the last 6 weeks. Why? That's when Russia invaded Afghanistan. All right. As I said, war brings default in debt. So this is what gold is reflecting. We have a lot of institutional clients in Europe. Instructed them, you better move your gold out of Europe, move it to the United States. Why? Because as soon as war happens, they put capital controls on. Just look at World War I. They shut down all the European stock markets. So they've been getting it out. And I've warned them, get it out before the first bullet is fired. Because as soon as that happens, they're going to clamp it down. And you have, also, you have exit taxes like Norway and stuff. I mean, even California, instead of reforming and saying, why are people leaving? Oh, let's just tax the bastards. I mean, it's, there are no mirrors in any government. And I've dealt with governments all over the world, and they're always the same. We are the enemy. It's always them. And they can't do what they want because we didn't do X, Y, Z or something. It's always the same thing.
Yeah. That's why I support your call earlier to reform government democracy. But I wonder if it's possible, though. At least it will be difficult. But I truly hope we will get to a point where citizens are freer than they are right now, and governments are much smaller.
That will come. It's what you're seeing, like the rise in AfD, etc., and Nigel in Britain with reform actually becoming like number one. We don't get off our couch and stop watching TV until it affects us, and that's what you're witnessing. It's the rise in these things. I mean, AfD, when they started, they're a bunch of Nazis in this fringe thing. Now, number one party, and so people everywhere, and I deal with all countries across the globe. And I would say it is a contagion. That the issue may be different between one country and another. But the bottom line is they're all just pissed off at their own governments. And I think if Ursula confiscates private assets, they're unused, good luck. Right. I think that's the nail in the coffin for the EU. Yeah. I do podcasts throughout Europe, and I would say 3 years ago, they would say, you really think the EU is going to break up? Now all I get is, when do you think it will break up?
And when that happens, you need to be prepared, and you have to make sure that your assets have already left the union.
Pretty much, because it's they'll most likely shift back to their own currencies. The centralized government always fails. The reason Rome lasted for 1,000 years was that it did not impose a centralized control. Yes, Christians said, they're pagans, they have hundreds of gods. Not exactly true. They just believed in freedom of religion. So if they conquered a country, they didn't have to give up their gods and worship theirs. So it's not that the Romans worship these people. The Emperor Elagabalus even brought his stone of Emesa to Rome, built a temple, and when they ended up killing him, they respectfully returned the stone to Emesa. Get it the heck out of out of Rome. So that freedom of religion is what kept Rome intact, and also that it was free trade. And I think this is an important point. Sanctions only break apart and lead to war. They do not create peace. You want peace, you allow, remove the sanctions from Russia, let everybody, interact, and then it's the people to provide the check and balance against the government. Yeah. Why are you going to do this? I'm going to lose business. Even in the American Civil War, Lincoln had passed an act that if you owed any money to a business in the South, you weren't allowed to pay them. It's the interconnection that creates peace. So somebody in the Roman Empire in France could make a vase and sell it to somebody in Syria. So that's why they remained. It was economically beneficial to be part of this common market, so to speak. And when you create a centralized government, we saw it during the election where Camilla, somebody in the audience said, about abortion and God. And she said, "You're at the wrong rally." So in other words, she gets in, and I don't care about your religion. You're going to do it my way. That's not, the way a head of state should run the country. This is the problem in Ukraine. Zelensky's outlawed their language, outlawed their religion, said Christmas is now December 25th, no more Orthodox stuff. You can't do this. If Canada tried that and said, okay, we're going to outlaw French, I think they'd be into civil war.
Yeah, the Quebecans wouldn't accept it. Yeah,
it said, okay, no more Spanish. You can't speak Spanish. You can't do this sort of thing.
Yeah. The politicians don't have the same historical knowledge as you have, unfortunately, Martin. But thanks so much for sharing all your wisdom and insights in this episode. I liked it a lot. Anything else you want to add? Of course, where can people find you?
At armstrongeconomics.com. You don't have to put in any emails. We don't sell advertising. We try and keep it open. And we're not blocked anywhere where you can view it in Russia. You're going to view it in China. We're one of the few that is not blocked anywhere.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Martin, for coming on the show. And perhaps we could do it again in the future.
Well, be glad to. Thanks a lot. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.